The sun has left and forgotten.
Your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief storymaker at Elkins Consulting. One of the most important objects in my home is our dining room table. Many of my stories begin with, we were sitting at our dining room table when... That table becomes a subtle but critical character in a lot of my stories. That's why this week's episode is part of the Podcastathon event to bring awareness and funding to the nonprofit organization, the Breaking Bread Village in Michigan. Please visit my website, elkinsconsulting.com, to learn more about this incredible organization making a big difference in reconnecting communities and addressing division and polarization in the U.S. You can also listen to the episode of this podcast I recorded with its founder and executive director, Aaron Patrice. Because this is a special week for the podcast, it's also my great pleasure to have recorded it with my dear friend, Jeff Ikler, host of the Getting Unstuck, Cultivating Curiosity podcast. We took this opportunity to discuss how meaningful objects can create stories of connection to ourselves, to each other, and to history. And a very special thanks to Lisa Weiss, host of the Object Diaries podcast. Her thoughtful and engaging show is the impetus for this episode of Your Stories Don't Define You. And you can listen to the wonderful episode of this podcast when I interviewed her. Again, visit elkinsconsulting.com to listen to that episode.
So, listeners, welcome to a joint production of two podcasts today. Sarah Elkins, Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will, and mine, Getting Unstuck, Cultivating Curiosity. And we'll explain in a minute why we're doing this together. It's going to be aired on both of our shows. Sarah, I said a little bit about you in the opener, and I'm going to ask you to elaborate in a very unique way, though. And in the past, I've started my episodes with, what's one thing you're curious about? And what I noticed is a lot of people are curious about a lot of things. And they say, oh, I'm curious about everything. And we never really got down to specifics in many cases. So I'm taking a little bit different approach. And this is something I'm stealing from you. Okay. So I'm going to ask you.
I give you permission.
All right. What's a meaningful object related to those that you serve that's on your desk, in your office, in your home somewhere that you can point to that says, this is really who I am. This is what I'm about?
Well, there are two, but I'm going to point out the one that's most important to me. I'm going to take it right off my wall. It's my word of the year.
Mm.
And I know some people know what that is. Our listeners may not know. Instead of doing New Year's resolutions, some of us pick a word that really resonates with us that we want to infuse our lives with over time for the year. And my word of the year is practice.
Ooh, say more.
And the reason I picked that word is because it gives me the luxury of, when I mess up, when I do something that I could have done better, of saying, it's okay, it's practice. I'm just getting better every time. This is a learning opportunity. It's practice. So whether it's a big performance, a keynote presentation to a large audience, or a musical performance at a bar, whatever, anytime I mess up, I think, okay, it's okay. It's practice. The other thing it does for me is it keeps me humble. I think about the fact that even when I do really well, when I have a client appointment that immediately has big impact on somebody, and I can tell you about one of those, but I think about it as, ooh, yeah, that was very satisfying. And then I look at that word again, and it's practice. There's still room for improvement.
Yeah, I love that because you're giving yourself grace to be imperfect, which is something that's really hard for me, as you know, right?
Well, it's never been hard for me in that way, but I do have, like a lot of thinkers, I have an internal dialogue that is often super critical of myself. It's not that I expect myself to be perfect. It's that it's like recently when I had an interaction with my older son, And he told me that it came across badly. He was so loving and respectful and courageous in telling me. And for a few days, I had an internal dialogue of how I messed up. Not that I expect myself to be perfect, but I could have really damaged my relationship with my kid. And then it was the aha moment of, but he gave me this gift and told me. So clearly we have a really good relationship that he feels confident enough and trusting enough.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. I like that practice. Was that from like a year, words of a year or something, or how did it come about? How did you select practice?
Well, it's funny you asked that question because years ago, I was on the board of the Women's Leadership Network here in Helena, Montana, and we did a retreat in January. And during our dinner, we had cooked together in this great retreat center. And these other women, some dear friends, said, this is what we're doing this year. It's called the Word of the Year, and this is why we're doing it. And we went around the table and everyone picked a word. And my word, don't laugh out loud. No, go ahead, laugh out loud, was focus.
Focus. Why would you ever say that, Sarah?
I know. You know me so well. At the time, now this was years ago. This is before I had StrengthsFinder as a tool to help me understand where my magic really is. But at the time, I was frustrated with myself because I was writing my book and I couldn't seem to get into flow and do the routine that all of the books, all of the podcasts, all of the articles talking about how to write your book talk about routine. And I felt like a total loser that I could not do. Every time I try, whatever came out was uninspired at best. And it felt like I was ripping my soul out of my body every time I sat down in the same spot at the same time every day. That does not work for me. There's nothing inspired about that for me. So I did that 2 years in a row. I picked focus. Because I kept thinking, I'm smart. I should be able to figure this out. And finally, that second year I picked it. And within 4 weeks, I realized this is not working for me. And 4 weeks after that, I took StrengthsFinder assessment, and focus as a talent is at the very bottom of my list.
Wow.
Of 34 talents, it's like number 30. And for our listeners, focus as a talent is those people who are really good at getting into flow. They have to get into flow every day to bring their best brain activity to whatever task they're working on. So that's their magic, is getting into that flow and being able to get work done in that period of time without interruption.
Right.
And it's a phenomenal talent. It's not mine. I was using somebody else's tool to try to get things done, and it wasn't comfortable in my hands. I was mangling whatever I was trying to use it on. So that's where Word of the Year came from. And it wasn't until a few years later that I realized, I just picked the wrong word. It's not the Word of the Year that's the problem. If you're going to use that as a guide for your year, pick a word that fits your talents. Pick a word that makes sense for how you approach things. So using the word practice makes so much sense for me because I have this adaptability talent, which means that I don't see obstacles the way most people see obstacles. I see them just as part of the path. And it also means that routine is not really a word of my vocabulary. If I get into routine, I get bored really fast and nothing gets accomplished. So having the word practice makes so much more sense for my talents.
Well, you got me thinking now.
Uh-oh. You do that to me all the time, so paybacks.
I'll let you know what I come up with, all right? Okay, you get to ask me a question.
Oh, yes. So I actually have a similar question, except that this time I want to put a twist on it. So the work you're doing now is almost exclusively tied to this incredible podcast you've had going for a while. When you think about your podcast, who is a person that has really inspired you in I know you have a lot, but particularly in continuing the podcast. So there are times I know that you go through the same thing I do after years and years of podcasting where I think, why am I still doing this?
Yeah.
And then I'll have an interview or an interaction with somebody that I realize, oh, that's why I'm still doing this.
That's such a good question. It's unfair because it's not the one I was practicing to answer.
I know this isn't in your top talents.
No, because usually you say, what's one thing people don't know about you? And I have a doozy of an answer.
Oh, well, let's do that one then.
No. I have somebody actually who immediately came to mind in answer to your question. And it's somebody we both know. It's Charlotte Whittenkamp.
Yeah. Oh, I love her.
Yeah, because she seems insatiable in terms of ingesting ideas and then making sense of ideas for herself and then putting it out there in the universe for other people to react to. And I wrote to her recently. I'm not on LinkedIn a tremendous amount anymore. I'm not on any social media a tremendous amount, but I do notice when I don't see people. And I wrote her and they say, hey, I miss you. What's going on? Because, usually she's got that thing, here's what I read today, or here's what I watched today. And I didn't see her. And it was really cute the way she wrote back. They had a series of family birthdays in February. And it was like, oh, I know what that's about, So, but it would definitely be Charlotte is somebody I have in mind because she's always responsive and she puts stuff out there that I would definitely not see because she's in it all the time.
I love that. And I agree. When I'm on LinkedIn and I feel myself endlessly scrolling and not finding anything of value on there, I go straight to Charlotte's activity because I know I'm going to find something that resonates with me. And I try really hard to interact on LinkedIn, not just post,
exactly.
But interact with other people's work, share other people's work. So, oh yes, I got to meet her in person because she lives within a few miles of my sister in California. So listeners, if you are not following Charlotte Whittenkamp on LinkedIn, do yourself a favor. Manage your LinkedIn feed so that you're seeing good stuff.
Yeah.
And make sure you're following her.
Yeah. She's gold there.
She is.
So Sarah, you're going to have to wait until Friday until my Substack comes out because I do reveal in the Substack something that people don't know about me. All right.
Okay. I'll keep an eye on it.
All right. All right. Very good. So one of the reasons I started with objects today is at the recent No Longer Virtual meeting in Austin, Texas. And I really thought it was a great one. I was so glad that I was able to make it. But you started the meeting in a very thoughtful way, which was instead of going around the room, there were 25 of us there, instead of going around the room and saying, all right, Jeff, introduce yourselves, tell us where you live, what you do, blah, 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 where you can see people starting to kind of turn off. Well, you go ahead. You introduce it. It was your idea. What did you have us do?
Well, it was my idea, but I need to give Lisa Weiss the credit for it because it was generated through my interview of her.
Oh.
She has a few episodes of the Object Diaries podcast out there, beautifully published. And so what I've been doing now consistently is asking people to think of an object, whether they have it on them or whether it's at home. I prefer it if they happen to have it with them, to let us know what that object is and why it's meaningful to them. But the way that I like to do it, because there are so many introverts in every room, I like to break them into pairs or trios, so that they can share with each other. And then I have the person who was listening tell the story of the object of the person that they questioned about it. And what that does is it takes the pressure off because you're not introducing yourself. Somebody else is introducing you. And it helps people see a more complex view of the human being in front of them. Just like my other question, which I usually start my podcast by asking, tell me something about yourself that most people don't know. And for our listeners, I ask that question because Especially now, we have a tendency to anchor people in time by one interaction we experience with them, whether that's online or in person. And it's not fair because we are complicated human beings. At any given time, we could be in an especially good mood, in an especially bad mood. Something good might have happened, something average or bad might have happened. So to hold somebody to one interaction and say, well, this is what that person is like, or this is that person's character or whatever, I find it to be very limiting and unfair. So having that object helps give a more complex view of whoever you're talking to.
Yeah, I love it. And I love being in a position where I was asked to really, really listen. Because sometimes when we do the standard introductions, it's almost, I hate to say this, but it's almost a throwaway. This is kind of perfunctory. We're going to go around the room and, blah, blah, blah. But here, I was sitting with somebody I didn't really know at all. I mean, I had met this person before, but I didn't really know much about him. And I really listened with curiosity as he was talking. And that's what I really liked. And then to be able to say it back and have it make sense is another thing, right?
Right. Well, and that's just exactly it. This is so much more memorable, like so much more memorable because, as you said, you were taking notes. You were madly taking notes because people's stories were meaningful about that object. And I can tell you, I did this with a workshop of nonprofit organizations across the Gallatin Valley in Montana. And one woman said she had walked in late, so she didn't participate in the activity. But she said, I felt like, when you hear about prayer beads and people have all these prayers associated with each bead on their prayer beads, she said, I feel like each story was a bead on my prayer bead necklace that I'm holding. And I was so touched by that description because it's right. Each story was precious.
Absolutely. And a cousin of how precious they were. Everybody was being vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were telling deeply personal stories, and it was like they were letting us in before we had really been introduced, which was really, I thought, very cool. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I do.
Yeah. All right. So you've done this, you do this in your workshops, and we did it at No Longer Virtual. What are one or two, Sarah, objects you remember from your workshops that people have brought up?
Oh, one of my favorites was a woman was introducing the gentleman next to her, a young man. And she said, this man has a teddy bear. And all eyes turned to him. It was majority women in the room. All eyes turned to this young man. And it turned out that this teddy bear he had just given to his 3-year-old daughter. But it had been his, and it had been his father's, that his grandfather gave to his father. And that, seeing that, it's not that he was especially macho or anything. As a matter of fact, he was very young and aware, conscious. That was obvious just from his demeanor and his posture. And yet, to hear a man talk about the teddy bear he just gave to his firstborn, but it wasn't him telling the story. And the woman who was telling it teared up as she was telling his story. So that's one that definitely stays with me.
Yeah.
What about you? What were a couple from NLV that were memorable to you?
So one that really comes to mind, and I'm going to try not to give away too many secrets about who this person is, but it was she. I think there were only 3 men at No Longer Virtual this year, 4 men, I think so. The odds were that it was going to be a female. But anyway, she talked about being on the beach with her family, and I think she was divorced, and the person that she's been dating was also there on the beach. And they were picking up stones. Everybody's walking different directions on the beach, and they were picking up stones and everything like that. And then they would bring them back to kind of a central location. And I think it was her son that picked up 2 of the stones, one that the man had picked up and one that she had picked up. And he goes, "Look, Mom." And he put the two stones together.
And they fit,
And
like
they
they were
fit.
clearly one broken stone.
Right.
That I remember that.
And she said, that's when I knew, it's like serendipity, right?
Oh,
So that was
that,
that was beautiful. That was captivating. There were
mhm.
there were a bunch that I kind of put into a grouping. One person had a sketchbook where she reflects anything having to do with joy. She'll just put something in there to reflect the joy and to have her feel joy. Another person had a pen, and they found that writing with a pen made a difference other than typing, that it was much more personal. Another person had a handmade journal that they had made and that they fill in. And another had something where he writes down literally pieces of information, little bits of information that he can use later because he doesn't want to trust his memory like I often do. I say, "Oh, I'll remember that," right? And it's
Right.
what did I forget? But those things were, I thought, they kind of fit together like a puzzle and how personal they were in talking about remembrances, but they all had this kind of a homemade feel to them. So those would be some.
Yeah, those are good stories. Well, one person was talking about their wedding ring and
Yes.
how meaningful that was to her. And this was a second marriage, and she was talking about how I can't remember all the details about it, but I just remember what I remember most about her story about that object was the emotion connected to it. This sense of finding the person who would bring her comfort and joy and deep, deep passion. And that's what I got from that story. So her wedding band and the way the other person was telling the story made it very clear that it was almost awkward and at the same time beautifully connecting.
Right. I remember something about that story where she said she will periodically look down at it during the day and get those feelings that you just expressed. So a lot of us wear wedding rings, and
Right.
I'm not saying it doesn't convey meaning, but she was actually, when she looked down on it, you could see her heart, speak love and be light. It was very powerful.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Somebody talked about getting the name of their recently deceased dog tattooed.
Yeah.
And boy, did that bring up memories for me.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what I meant, Sarah, when I said vulnerability, because she actually started to tear up. I mean, you could see how raw that was for her, that she lost this close friend,
Yeah. And I think the other power of that is that it unlocks our stories. So every person that had an object in there, when their object was described, at least a couple of people in the room looked at their own similar object. Like when we were talking about the rings, I looked at my ring and I had the memory of receiving my engagement ring, which was my mother-in-law's. So when she died, she gave it to my husband and he gave it to me when we got engaged after asking his siblings for permission. So every story that went through there had some connection to other people in the room.
Right.
And that's the whole goal of sharing stories, or it needs to be, is to create that connection and have somebody else in front of you be eager to share their own related story, because that's what builds connection.
Yeah, that's a great word, because I was thinking about one where somebody shared their headphones and said that he has to wear these because he had an injured eye. And now a lot of information comes to him through his headphones because he's having trouble reading. And boy, what a powerful statement. And I think then of myself and how I take my sight for granted. And he's living through earbuds in a sense. Any books that he reads, he's reading through earbuds.
And he's a reader, which makes it doubly important to have a tool, to have that tool to be able to continue to live the life that he wants to continue to live.
Right.
I love it. I'd like to interject here something. This episode is going to be posted in combination with a podcastathon, which is podcasts from around the world, all publishing in the same week to raise awareness and funds for nonprofits, global nonprofits. And mine is going to the Breaking Bread Village. So this episode is the reason I picked this episode to be published on the day, which let me check my calendar so I can make sure I'm giving the correct day. It's going to be on March. Where did I put it? I know it's in my calendar here somewhere. I think it's next week. No, 2 weeks. Anyway, the point is the Breaking Bread Village brings people together in panel discussions to talk about current issues over food. So they have food provided, they have audiences that can come and listen to the panel discussion. And it's been very successfully bringing people together from all over to talk about things and reconnect and rebuild the communities that have been falling apart and polarized. And the reason I want this one is because when we started talking about objects, I realized one of my most hidden objects that is in plain sight, that is meaningful to me, is our dining room table.
Mm-hmm.
Because we've had hundreds and hundreds of people sit at our dining room table over the last 30 years. My husband and I we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of our first date coming up in April of 2025. And that table has witnessed so much community building. We've had incredible conversations, sad conversations. And for our listeners, I will make sure that Jeff and I both have the link to a poem that's posted in my kitchen that a dear friend gave to me about the dining room table. It says the kitchen table, around the kitchen table. I can't remember what the title is. But when I think about objects in my home that are symbols of something really important to me, that dining room table is probably one of the most important.
And I'm privileged to have sat at that dining room table.
Yes.
Yeah.
I loved feeding you at that dining room table.
Sarah, give me the name of the organization that you're submitting this to.
It's called the Breaking Bread Village, is the nonprofit that this is trying to raise awareness for. And I will have a link and I can send it to you for the podcastathon that is happening in mid-March.
Okay. I'll include that. I was actually going to post this next week. So I hope that helps. Okay, good. All right. Okay. Anything else, Sarah, that you want to say about objects, either, from the work that you've done through your consulting or what we did at No Longer Virtual?
Yes. I would encourage listeners to think about the hidden objects that have meaning for you, that are symbols of something important to you, something maybe that you carry with you. It might be jewelry. It might be a tattoo. It might be a pen. Think about that, because if you are having a hard time connecting with somebody, this is a great icebreaker. You can look down at your hand and make an expression of love or sadness or whatever it is, and then explain to them, oh, my ring just caught my attention, and this is why that matters to me. You can discreetly ask, oh my gosh, what about those shoes? Where did you get those shoes? You can find something on the person in front of you that obviously has some sort of meaning to them and ask them about it.
Yeah. Since you brought this up, I've been working on a memoir for a year and looking for the spine or the structure for these various essays. And, for me, my strength finders, I need to see this roadmap. It's very hard to write, oh, I'm just going to write, this essay, and this essay.
You're not a blank page kind of person.
And so focusing in on objects has started to open doors like you can't believe. Because when I think of objects, all of a sudden the memories behind them start coming up. And stuff, I have a lot of trouble remembering the early years. But when I think about objects, details start to emerge. It's very cool. It's very cool.
It is. And the other aspect of that is that object becomes a character in your story. I can't tell you how many stories begin with, we were sitting at our dining room table when, or I was hiking on the mountain when. The dining room table and the mountain become characters in this story.
Yeah, that's well put. Yeah. All right. Anything else, Sarah? I do have one question or one favor to ask of you before we go, but anything else you want to say about objects?
Well, I would like to hear from you one more thing. When you asked the superintendent of schools out in California about an object on her desk, and then you asked me that question, it makes me curious about yours. What object helps you that's on your desk or in your office that you see every day that reminds you of why you do what you do?
Well, this is the one I spoke about at No Longer Virtual. The little stone. The stone that I picked up illegally on Omaha Beach. And it's literally vibrating in my hand right now. It's because of men that died on that beach. And I had to have this, and I have it right on my desk that I look at every day. And it just the price that people pay for what I have, and yeah, it's such a, I don't know if you've ever been, but it's a magical place because you walk that beach and then you walk up the escarpment, the bluff, and it opens up on the U.S. military cemetery with 9,400 graves. And it's like, you cannot help but be overcome. And it's one of, I don't know how many hundreds of graves in Europe with servicemen. So, yeah, so that's an important one.
It is. And what that also reminds me of is your sense of place when you're standing where history happened, like when you walked into Anne Frank's through the door into Anne Frank's annex.
Right.
And when you stood on that beach, and because of our relationship, I pay attention to that. I always felt it, but I never paid attention like I do now. And there have been a few times where I've had the opportunity to share that. So, for instance, we were on one of the Civil War battlegrounds near Richmond, Virginia, with our boys a few years ago, and we were standing in the trenches that were likely filled with blood and mud and body parts at different points. And I said something to our boys about feeling where we were and living in the history. And then when we were in Europe, on the east coast of Europe near Bari, there was another battleground where you could just have that sense of place. And one other place, when we were in Saint-Rémy de Provence in southern France, where Van Gogh spent his last year in a sanitarium. And we walked the path, and there were places where I could stop and look at where I was and remember one of his paintings. Wow. That I was standing exactly or within a few feet of where he was standing when he painted those iconic images. So thank you for that gift that you've given me.
Last night, I think I told you, Jen and I went to the Anne Frank exhibit here in New York City. And in a locked, secure case, they had that red and white diary that she first started her diary in. And just, you're literally a foot or two away from, her words. But I do want to say one thing that I always am compelled to say when I talk about Anne Frank. She was one of 25,000 kids who were murdered. 25,000 kids from Holland, the Netherlands, who were murdered in the Holocaust. She was just one. And she doesn't stand in for the rest of them. She's not an object for the rest of them. She is who she is. It's important to remember that so many kids were lost in that.
And that's just the Netherlands.
That's
25,000 children from the Netherlands alone. And that is a small country.
Yeah. 102,000 Jews died from the Netherlands. So I want to close out. I want you to tell the audience about your upcoming TED Talk.
Oh, okay. I'm very excited about this. I will be speaking on November 3rd in Washington, D.C., TEDx U Street Women. It'll be at the University of the District of Columbia. And while I haven't finalized my title, I can tell you that it is about sharing personal stories to reduce polarization and division. And the key point being, we have to share stories with the intention of connecting and not with the intention of persuasion.
On it. If you persuade, fine, but it's more important just to connect.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're missing so much. You hear so many people talk about storytelling, particularly in business, and it's such a buzzword now. A lot of people call themselves storytellers because they're in marketing or whatever it is. But we are all storytellers, but we're not all professional storytellers. And the point is, we can all share a personal story to connect with people. And we can only do this one relationship at a time. That's the only way we are going to change this dynamic.
I'm nodding for our listeners.
Mm-hmm.
I'm nodding.
So thank you for asking.
Yeah. All right. Very good. Sarah, thank you so much. And this was a lot of fun. And it was a very meaningful, I won't call it an exercise. It was a meaningful experience to start no longer virtual this way. And I encourage people who are listening, if you're planning an event, try it because, boy, it just changed everybody. I mean, it just really got us feeling closer immediately.
It did.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this conversation, Jeff.
The time you must keep on trying. Smile, what's the use of crying? You'll find that life is still worthwhile if you just smile.